local celebrity, author of The Judgment of Yo-Yo Gold and the Lifetimes of Pretty Rosen. And he's an excellent teacher at the soccer academy for excellent students. Yeah, and I gotta move. Anyway,
I'll proceed.
as they say in England, go to it.
Thank you. I'm Isaac. I wrote those two books, and what I thought I would do is sort of tell you a little bit about like a little bit about the first book in case you're not aware of it, and then a little bit about like how I got from the first book to the second one. And then I thought it's not big, it's not like I'm talking in front of my usual like 2,000, 5,000 people. So we could just have a conversation if there's anything you have questions about, because you might hear about I don't know, I might tell you something about like my inspiration for this book or whatever, but you might want to know like who chooses the font in the book, or like what the difference is between like a literary agent and an editor, or just who knows what, or what I had for lunch today would be. I don't know why that would be of interest to you, but you could ask me.
Or if you knew you were going to be a writer when you were
Or if I knew I was going to be, so you can hold that question until the end.
Okay.
And then if there's like an awkward silence, you can have a great time. Next slide, please. Lackey, thank you. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so in like after 2016, essentially, I saw what I thought was a fairly horrifying rise in anti-Semitic crime and just anti-Semitism in general in the United States. And as is often the case, I then think, okay, if I perceive this thing, is it in the data? So when I looked around, I found that it was. So like this is an example of data in the form of a bar chart, and you can see that the numbers going up, that's often very good. So if that's like your bank account, you want that. But if this is, in this case, it's anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, so going up is not good. And I did not like the direction that I was going in. And I was also very surprised to know that basically half or more of all religiously motivated hate crimes in the United States are perpetrated against Jews, which is weird. It's a really small portion of the population. So I found that upsetting. And I was thinking about it a lot. Next slide. And in addition to the data, I'm also looking at all of this, sort of being inundated with all of these headlines, particularly stories of people in Jewish institutions like the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, and then just like random violence on the street of people who just present as Jewish on the street, because of the way they might dress traditionally, because of their religion. So that was upsetting. Next slide, please. And I was also seeing stuff like this, where, for example, there was an Orthodox community moving into another town, and that town was really pushing back in a way that didn't seem on the surface problematic. Like, I think if there was a huge influx of any large group, some sort of singular group into a new place, there would be questions about like, what are we going to do? How this is going to mess with but affect the public school budget? What's our downtown going to look like if we have different people who want to go to different types of stores or institutions, right? Those are reasonable questions. But every time I read the articles and I read quotes from people in those communities, there was always, to me anyway, this undercurrent of anti-Semitism in it as well. So I also found that disturbing. Next slide. And then there was this particular attack, shooting at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, New Jersey. And that happened in December of 2019. And about a week later, I started writing The Life and Crimes of Pretty Rosen, which was sort of just taking all that stuff that I was seeing and turning it into a kind of coming of age novel about a 15-year-old Jewish boy. Yeah.
Did you have anything that you were going to be writing about something like this, and just so happened that, unfortunately, you got all this information to use in order to write the book? Or was it just based on?
It was really just, I was always I'm trying to think how old I was at the time. How old am I now? I'm like 36. So this was probably, so that's like 6, so it's like 30. So I've been writing, and I had written already 5 or so novels, none of which had been published. So I was always looking for the next thing to write. But I didn't think like, oh, I'm going to write a book about anti-Semitism, or I'm going to write a book about even write a book about a religious person. There was a bunch, it wasn't something like I was waiting for that thing. This was just, or if I was, it was just that I was in a perpetual state of waiting for something to inspire me to write something. It's always trying to think, okay, well, what's the next idea that's going to get me started on the next thing? So I guess the answer to your question is like a yes and no kind of thing. I didn't have this in mind, but I'm always.
And you were teaching at the time?
Yeah, so I was teaching at the time, in part because I was teaching at the time at an Orthodox Jewish boarding school, talking with my students about a lot of this stuff. So it was on like all of our minds. And so that was another reason that it felt like sort of more urgent, I guess, in that time. Next slide, please. So this stuff happened. So I kind of included a couple extra slides of like, because if my book asks the question afterwards, I could ask like, did I solve anti-Semitism through my young adult novel? And that exposes the horrors of anti-Semitism. And the answer is no, that I did not, because this report about, you know, since October 7th, having anti-Semitic incidents up 400% happened well after my book came out, and this was at the time that my second book, the Yo-Yo book, was in copy edits, and there was some discussion of like, should we step back and address all this stuff in the book, or have we, you know, has that ship sailed? It's its own thing. You know, there was this question of like, should we try to do something at the last minute with all of this stuff? Next slide. Okay. And then this is just another answer to the question, did I solve anti-Semitism? And the answer is still no. So we can see that over the course of really decades, this was a survey where people were asked, like, do you endorse any of these like sort of notions or conspiracy theories about Jews? So it asked questions like, are Jews universally wealthy? Are they controlling? Are they, you know, are there any secret, all those sorts of, you know, any sort of Jewish stereotypes that might exist? Do you endorse these? And on those same surveys, people endorsed fewer and fewer of them over time. And then as you can see, they started endorsing very suddenly many, many more of them, basically erasing the progress that had been done since the 1960s through various education, including but not limited to my book. Not that I actually thought that had anything to do with it, but that's really just a joke. Okay, next slide. And then this is, I imagine that some of you can picture this intersection. Was it Remington and is it Lancaster there? Yeah. So this was just a few months ago. So I also didn't solve anti-Semitism on the main line either, unfortunately. Next slide. Okay, so after I wrote that book, the first book, which won an award, and this is, if it's hard to read, I'll speak the dialogue. I had 2 book deals. So when I sold the first book, there was an untitled, unspecified second book attached to it that I was just sort of like, you got to write it later, Isaac. And so I was assuming that later would never actually arrive. And then it did, you know, like time passed and I had to write another book. And the first book had been fairly successful and won an award, and that was cool. So I sat down with my agent and my editor, and they said, what's next? Do you have any cool ideas? And I was like, yeah. Like I had like multiple years, I had a nice list and all drawn out, and I presented them with this list. They were going to be really excited about it. And I was like, I sure do. What about like a story about teen mental health? There's all this stuff about how teens have bad mental health. You can let me know if that's true or not, I don't know. What about this dystopian story about, we had this pandemic, what about this, I had the story for another pandemic that was like a new, I called my disease new consumption. You know, because we had previous consumption, this was a new consumption. I was going to set my story at like a sanatorium that was like kind of like an old consumptive tuberculosis sanatorium, but it's like in the future. I was like, that's a dope idea. Like they're going to be all over that. And then I was like, what about androids? But they're pretending to be human, and but instead of like other ways, they're just a regular high school. You know, one of them's like dating a cheerleader or something, and trying to prove to her, and they were like, no, like these are not Jewish ideas, Isaac. So that's not cool. Can't do that. And I was like, all right, well, what if I just make all the androids or the sick people Jews? And they were also not into that. They were like, okay, which was interesting. Like it was an interesting process for me of like, before I had published a book, I was a certain sense of just throwing different things at the wall. But once I had succeeded, and because the book did well, that sort of like created like a niche sort of thing. And there was a set of expectations that like, yeah, you can play around like in this space, but for now, we would really like with the book that we have already paid you for, you to play within these confines. Which on the one hand was, I think, I mean, for a moment kind of annoying, but then also sort of freeing in the sense of instead of having to choose from amongst 1,000 ideas, I had to boil it down to, you know, sometimes it's nice to be like, all right, you know, choose this within this area. Next slide, please. So my editor, her name is Talia. If you want to picture her, she's like a kind of brown-haired woman in her late 30s. And she said, "Do you think you could write a girl voice?" And I was like, "Okay, what does that mean?" And she was like, "Girls, they have some understanding of what's going on around." So she read my other stuff where there are boy characters and they don't like
Oh, no.
get what other people are thinking or feeling, and she's like, "Girls aren't like that. They like think about what other people are feeling, what other people are thinking, and they have some understanding of how someone might feel if you said this or that to them and all of that kind of stuff." So I was like, okay, that's useful advice. I'll give it a shot. Next slide. Okay, so what actually kind of inspired, so to speak, this book was that when I wrote the Hoodie book, I really thought of it as a book about a very Jewish book about anti-Semitism and some sort of intra-Jewish stuff. And then when the book got to some readers, I started hearing from readers, some of whom were not Jewish, but who still found the story of a young person sort of grappling with their faith for the first time and figuring out what they believe in relation to what their family believes. They found that to be a story that they saw themselves in and found meaningful. And so I received like a bunch of emails, or when I went to a conference, people would tell me like, okay, I don't know a single thing I've never met a Jew in my life, but there was something about this story that resonated with me because of like my evangelical background or my Catholic upbringing or any of these things that just sort of put them in a space to have that like processing of faith and family expectations and those sorts of things intermingling. And this was just a screenshot of like this sort of guest essay that I wrote, because it really changed the way you would think. Like I've read the Hoodie Rosen book like literally hundreds of times. So by the time it came out, I thought I had really gleaned from it everything that was there. And then it was interesting to see that this was the thing that sort of had resonated with other people. And that got me thinking, all right, well, if that worked the first time, maybe I'll do that again. But from a girl's perspective and with some help of my agent and editor who had sort of been through that, essentially through the process that Yo-Yo Gold goes through in the book, so they could sort of help me through that. So that's where I decided, like, once I'd been narrowed and the androids had been kicked out, hearing from other people about what they got out of Hoodie Rosen sort of put me in the direction of writing the Yo-Yo Gold book. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I said to them, and I'll have you, I think it's worth noting, we've changed color schemes here.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we went from the Hoodie Rosen color scheme to the Yo-Yo Gold color scheme, which is harder to read because the black doesn't stand out as well, but nonetheless. So what about two different Jewish girls, I said to them. One is Orthodox, one Reform. They're both the daughters of rabbis, and they question their faith and learn about different ways to be Jewish and some stuff like that. And Talia, that's my editor, said, okay, but it needs some kind of conceit, some kind of twist, something to give it more than just a examination of faith or a coming of age story. Next slide, do I have that? Okay, so then I read Gossip Girl, which came out in like the very early 2000s. And has anyone read Gossip Girl? It's a popular television
It was
show.
also a TV show.
Yes.
My daughter
Has
even
has anyone read the books?
Sarit has.
All right. I don't necessarily recommend them, but there's a certain, one of the things that I think has been, when I was younger and I was reading books, like I'd come to the Balcony Library and get a stack of books, I could sort them and be like, I hated this book, I love this book, I hated this book, I love this book. And I think over time I started thinking, as I started writing more, I started asking myself not whether or not I liked it, but whether or not it successfully accomplished what it was trying to do. So not all books were doing something that I wanted them to do or was good for me as a reader. But I tried to ask myself, like, did this person accomplish what they were trying to do successfully? And if so, how? And what I think is interesting about Gossip Girl is that while I did not enjoy it, because I'm definitely not the target audience, I think it's very, very successful at what it's trying to do. And the plot is that you have these extremely rich northern Manhattan, like Upper West or Upper East Side, I don't know which, girls going to really, really fancy prep schools and doing all sorts of things they shouldn't be doing, drugs, drinking, sex, whatever. But there's someone who is on it, this is like pre-social media, but like on an internet blog is anonymously blogging their activities, almost like a gossip column about them. So on the one hand, you have their interpersonal relationships and the stuff that they're doing drives the plot. But then you also have this twist of sort of a mystery of wondering, like, who's gossip girl the whole time? Who's writing about this? Who knows about all these activities and is writing about them in this sort of pithy way? And although I didn't fully do that with the Yo-Yo book, that's where the sort of conceit of the book came, where one of the characters starts posting social media posts, sort of reporting on usually transgressions of her friends, essentially, which is anonymous, of course, until maybe it's not anonymous, and then maybe bad things happen. I don't want to spoil the book. But that's sort of, it's not that I was like, oh, well, this is going to be like Jewish Gossip Girl. It's just that that was the thing that kind of unlocked, like the, okay, here's the little twist, here's the little conceit, the thing I can play around with in the plot. Next slide. Oh, and that's just sort of it. Yeah, I got some good stuff. Is that the last slide? My servant. I'm allowed to joke. He's my father, my humble servant. Is that it?
Seems to be.
Okay, so can we go back to the very first slide that's completely blank so that I don't have to, that's like too dark. There we go, perfect. Okay, so then the book came out and received some good accolades. And I think the last thing I would say is that the first book that I wrote before it was under contract and was just sort of me writing it. It was just me alone in the process, which was interesting and is its own thing. And the second book, because it was an idea that I sort of came up with in collaboration with an editor who was already on board, it became this kind of like collaborative process. I did the actual typing, but lots and lots of meetings about, like, I had never been an Orthodox Jewish teenager. So there were parts of me that were very nervous about trying to write that. But my agent and editor both had been Orthodox Jewish teenagers and also had access to large network of current such people. So there was a sense of like this much more sort of hands-on, what about this? Okay, maybe, or like, hey, do you think this would work? Or here's a thought I had, does that seem realistic? A much more collaborative effort with it, which is cool. So when there is like an accolade, like NPR puts it on its best of the end of the year list, it feels this kind of like we sort of thing of like this, we went through this process together as a group, and then it feels much more of a group, I don't know, just a nice thing, and it was a different and interesting process to write a book in a more collaborative way. I don't think I have anything else that I need to present. But if you have any questions or other
Take that
things.
one step further, because you said the Orthodox, you didn't grow up Orthodox, so but now take that a step further and put the female perspective on it. How much correcting did they need to do for you? Putting yourself.
I would say
in
more
shoes.
correcting in the, one of the things, all right, so I remember there was a conversation of like, okay, I gotta get this girl in school. And I've spent a good amount of time at Orthodox Jewish boys' schools, but I have not spent any time in girls' schools. And they're like usually separate, depending on, how religious we're going to be. And so I needed like, what are these girls talking about in the hallway? What are they whispering? What's on the note they're passing, in class? Those kinds of things. So we had a lot of conversations about that, which I think is sort of hitting both of those things. It's like, okay, what's it like to be in this environment? What's the school? And then also, how are they interacting with each other because, I don't know what we like, boys, you just wrestle mostly. If you haven't just, that's not really how girls tend to be. So I don't know which of those I needed more. I needed a good amount of them, of both, I think. And then the other thing that was interesting about that, the switch there, is that I thought a little bit about, so there's like a lot of jokes in the Hoodie Rosen book. And when I went back and I tried to think, like, why isn't the Yo-Yo book coming out as funny? In my mind, I didn't think it was. And I realized, so I went back and I analyzed, like, if the jokes are funny, because it's weird to call your own jokes funny, what makes them funny in Hoodie? And I realized that so much of the humor is him not understanding stuff. So much of it is just like, his vocabulary is terrible. So when his sister tells him to act obsequious and deferential or whatever, he has to say, well, like, can you give me a dictionary? Because otherwise I'm not gonna be able to act those things because I don't know what they are. And it's in the book, it's kind of a funny scene, but it doesn't work. And if you're trying to have a character who's just more aware of stuff. So much of the humor that worked in the first book, I couldn't transplant in this one because it wasn't realistic for her just to like not know basic things in the same way that I think it's realistic for boys. not to know. Just today, I was talking to a boy who did not realize that there were pictures of Hitler. He was like, he's just a 17-year-old boy, and he was like, wait, they had cameras back then? And I was like, it's not that long ago, but like, yeah, they sure did, like video even, audio recordings, and his mind was blown. And I just don't think there are many, I think that's like, there are 17, there are numerous 17-year-old boys.
Understand what
Yeah.
happened in
So
the.
that tells me about the education he's received.
Well, I gave him a second education, so let's not, you know. But the, my point is that there's just like he could have told you about World War II, but there's just a level of like a sort of disconnect from, I don't know what it is, this is, I think it's a boy thing, and I think it would have been unrealistic to write a girl who's asked that same question. That's kind of the part of
I mean,
what-
that's kind of mind blowing. I mean, there are photographs of Abraham Lincoln, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, are there any of him and Hitler together?
Photos.
Photoshop, oh, sure, there are probably some memes, yeah,
Right.
for sure, definitely. Sure.
When I was 17 or thereabouts, and I was studying all this history. And then for some reason, I was saying something to my mom and she goes, you know, life wasn't black and white. And I was like, what do you mean? It's because everything I saw
Mhm.
was a black and white
Yeah.
photo, everything was black and white. So in my mind, I pictured, like reality is black and white.
Right, before TV and, right,
Right.
before television, anything moving, baseball is only on the radio.
Yeah.
So they only,
So it's not
people
true
just
history?
talk. Yeah, people just talked about it. This is a real aside, but the Phillies lost both the first game ever broadcast on the radio and the first game ever played under lights.
Cincinnati. Right?
One was in Cincinnati, one was in Pittsburgh, yeah. They lost both of those games.
Man, you're a massive Philly sports fan, aren't you?
Yeah,
Can't hide it.
yeah, we can talk about sports. Do
I
just,
was less than zero, but I know less than zero. I have two boys who. Probably should.
well, I mean, okay,
I know nothing, but I'd be willing to learn,
okay.
you know, from.
Maybe the next book would be a little, yeah.
Philly
sure.
sports, sure.
Yeah.
I don't have so many questions, but I have so many questions. When you wrote the book, did you leave it with certain things that you were not sure if you had resolved the whole thing? Did you know that this was the end? You had finished it, you had done what you accomplished, that you had accomplished what you intended to do? Or do you still look back and think, well, maybe I should have just tweaked that a little bit, or
I think
more
about
about the writing process?
more about the writing process. I think constantly about things that I should have tweaked or changed, or wish I had changed or tweaked, or wondered if I had written it a different way, or all sorts of questions like that, yeah. And before, what was interesting is before I published the book, I could do that forever. And there's actually a kind of freedom of like, until it's published, it isn't final. It's always in a draft, it's always in revision. And there's something like neat about that, because you can wait. And that was one of the hardest things about writing this book, is like when I was writing the Hoodie book, if I ran into a problem or something that I couldn't figure out, I could wait a year to fix it if I wanted to, 6 months, whatever. With this book, it was like I had a deadline in 3 weeks. So if I didn't fix it, I just had to choose whatever was gonna allow me to meet the deadline. And that was really, that's a stressful process there. So I obsess about, basically, yes, the answer to your question is yeah, I obsess about all of those things. I wonder all the time. I try my best not to once it's finished and like just out, because like, yeah, I truly can't go back, so I try not to, but it leaks in there, the walls going everywhere.
At the time you handed it in, though, did you feel it's done? Or did you want to say, give me another couple of weeks?
No, I would have loved to say, give me another couple weeks, give me another couple years. I think honestly, the best part of writing something, or a book anyway, is like when it's kind of done, but it hasn't really come out yet, there's no one who can like judge it and whatnot, and still sort of pretend it's perfect, you know? I think that's the special, but when you hand it in and it's like, is this final, that's a scary, it really scares me to put that final bow, that final stamp, it really is. Before the first book came out, I had this panic, just when that was too late, and I sent a desperate email that I would be way too embarrassed to read or even look at to my editor saying, can we still change this, and this, and this, and this, and that, or, you know, it's too late, what can we do? And she was like, You're not the first person to send an email like this. You won't be the last, but there is nothing we can do or change. It's fine. You know, find a good therapist.
To no one.
Is that you second guessing yourself? Like, do you,
Yeah,
but that, like, then you have to just convince yourself, go with your gut feeling, which was the original thing that you did.
oh, I mean, no, you don't have to convince yourself. You can try to offload it onto someone else, say, tell me what to do in your expertise. You know, like an editor or something, or you can just suffer. And when in the unsure feeling of wondering whether you did it right or whether you've made some horrible, irrevocable mistake.
So
Yeah.
when you read it today, do you still see things, tiny things here or there that you wish could have been different?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I can think of, numerous examples. Of things that I would go, yeah.
Even if you've won an award? I mean, that's kind of a validation.
Yeah, I still, like, I feel proud, I feel proud of it, but I can feel proud of it and still think there are things that I wish I changed or. Yeah, because you just don't have it, like, it has to be, on the one hand, there's a freeing aspect of like, okay, there's a final deadline and it goes out in the world and that's it. And so it is out of your control, so you shouldn't, and there's also, if it does, on the one hand, that's freeing, and on the other hand, that the finality of it does leave a kind of helpless feeling, because if something does occur to you, there's nothing you can do.
No, I found the whole idea of being an outcast from your community very interesting. I mean, Esty was a very interesting
Mhm.
character, and when she comes back and you understand a little bit more about what happened, it kind of turns things around in your thinking.
Yeah,
And then Yo-Yo could potentially have ended up in that role and then decides that she's gonna kind of come clean, and hopefully things will change a little bit for her.
yeah, I think the thing with Esty, and I'm not gonna say too many, because I don't know if people read the book but is that one of the things I try to think about is like how to subvert the reader's expectations in some way, like what the reader expects about a character or about the plot or something. Like, try to think of ways to disappoint them or surprise them or something, because it's like not that interesting where something just sort of works out like you, and I think what you expect, and I think that works especially well or not especially well, but I think a good trick with that is when the narrator tells you something and is convinced of something that turns out not to be what they thought. Because if you spend, I don't know, 300 pages with this narrator, presumably you're going to start to trust them in a sort of implicit way, unless like they just come off as a liar, which most protagonists don't. So I think that's, I don't know, it's a fun thing to play around with.
Yeah, I thought it was really good.
Thank you.
I have a question about your, the person you mentioned, Talia, your editor, is that?
Talia's my editor.
And the other person.
Rena is my
Okay.
agent.
So do those people work with Penguin all of the time? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, I thought you got everything really convincingly. Really, it was very convincing. But as a former Judaic librarian, I used to notice that if there were reviews, like School Library Journal would review a book, and they wouldn't ever, the publishers were afraid to mention that the book had Jewish content. So if there's a book that was written by a woman about losing her mother and the mourning process in Judaism.
Sure.
But they mentioned this is about a girl in mourning, and they on purpose would never mention.
What's the book you know?
Yes, it's a graphic
Is
novel.
it Dancing at the Pity Party by Tyler Fetter?
Yeah, so Dancing, it was a very good book, it really,
It's a really good book.
it was it got awards from at least the Association of Jewish Libraries, where it actually explained the mourning process and with pictures, and it was really therapeutic for the author. But if you read the review in School Library
You
Journal,
wouldn't know that it
you
was
would just
Jewish.
say it was about a girl who lost her mother.
Oh, it's a pretty Jewish book.
I know, but that's what was happening, I would say 2 years ago. In like 2023, let's say, 22, 23. This would happen all the time
Yeah.
with books, the books would get awards, Anya and the Dragon.
Yeah, by
That-
Sophia Pasternak.
Right.
Yeah.
another, like, it's Jewish folklore,
Yeah.
but they will never mention in the reviews
Huh.
that. So I was curious if those young women were always working, were hired specifically to help
So
you
it's
with your
interesting, so the way it generally works is that the editor works for the publisher specifically, like is a salaried employer
Right.
of, in this case, Penguin Random House. So like Talia is an editor who works for Penguin Random House. Her job is to acquire material, take it through the publishing process, send it out to the world. That's her job. Literary agent usually works for themselves or for a literary agency, and they work sort of on behalf of the author, trying to sell to as many, whoever will buy, whatever publishers will buy the books. So I don't know who decides, but then what's tricky is that, like, Talia's job is to help me write the book, and to a certain extent to present, to like sell it to the company at large. But the people who write the marketing materials, the people who write the little blurb thing that's gonna go to the school library journal, who would then write the review, that's gonna be written by somebody else at the publisher, who's gonna make any number of marketing and sales decisions about which books they're gonna try to sell the most and push the most, how they're going to position them, and all of those things. And that process is very, very opaque. And I would be lying if I had any idea. There
That
was
must be
one,
what I was seeing.
yeah, there was one point where before Hoodie came out, it was like the little blurb was like, this book meets this book in blah, 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 I don't remember. And I got an email, it was like, the team thinks we should change book X to book Z, but leave book Y the same in that. And I was like, in my head, I was like, who comprises the team? Why did they think that? Like, who, you know, I didn't, what I said in the email was like, great, thanks. But I said all of this, because if I ask the question, it's just like creating more of a chore for Talia to explain something to me that she might not know the answer to, or that like isn't gonna make that much sense to me. Anyway, I have no control over it, neither does she. So there's just all of these, I don't know, layers. I will say about both of those women that they are, and there's like, not that big a community, but a really solid one of people who do a lot of work within publishers and within representing books as agents pushing Jewish books, like really representative Jewish books. Like my agent, Rothner, represents mostly Jewish books. And
Right,
if you
so with
read
different publishers?
with all different publishers, and if you just pick up like let's say there are 10 of 20 Jewish children's books published in any given year, she probably represented, why would I say 10? If you pick up 20, she probably represented 7 of them or something like that. She represents a huge portion of Jewish England.
So do you think that the sort of de-Judaization of those comments has something to do with trying to avoid protest of some sort?
I don't know, we've discussed it at conferences. And it's hard to come up with answers because I guess we didn't speak to the right people.
I think the hope would be that if that's something that's happening, it's the idea that if you say it's Jewish, it's going to hope they might think, well, it'll just appeal to Jewish readers. Whereas grief and death are universal, everyone dies.
Absolutely.
So if you don't mention it, maybe they're thinking, if we don't mention it, it might appeal to everybody.
Right,
Whereas
and
if we
also
say it's
there's-
Jewish, people
right,
might be like,
exactly.
I don't even really know what that is,
There
I'm
are
not gonna get involved
repercussions
there.
about that. A book came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it was a novel, and it was supposed to be about a summer trip to Israel. And what's it called?
It's called, hold on, it's called Once More with Chutzpah
Right, exactly.
by Haley Neal.
Right, exactly, and it's supposed to be similar to Birthright, which is a post-college trip, but this was a high school group. And there was so much, before it even came out on Goodreads, which is a site that where there are a lot of reviews of young people often make the reviews. There was a lot of protests, there was a lot of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
From I don't know. Anyway, protests, hate mail, it was on Goodreads, so
Sure,
it was
yeah.
mail, hateful comments before it even came off the press.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what it's trying to avoid, and you're good.
That's another good point, you're just trying to
really good with your
avoid that.
titles, by the way.
I came up with neither of them, but.
I know, but you're good recall.
I thought you meant my time. I was like, oh, I recall.
Reading the YA books that you're recalling, did your students read either of your books?
I would really struggle to describe the full level of apathy they have about reading in general.
And it also has audio, if you go on the website. you can
Yes.
Yes,
listen to the
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, they both have audiobooks. I
Yeah,
haven't
amazing.
listened to the Hoodie one in a while, but the Yo-Yo one's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found it somewhere.
Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah, just, I've been sitting here looking at the book, so how involved did you get with the artwork and the covers?
I went somewhere between none at all and very little. I trying to think if I had any.
Who did it?
So all right, I'll tell you the one thing I thought was the process is really interesting to me. So the publishing company hires an outside artist. I thought that the person who did the Hoodie book did a great job. They asked me almost nothing whatsoever. The only input I gave, I think that I can remember, is that if you look really carefully in the photo, there's some broken glass in the storefront. And that was my suggestion. I said, how about some broken glass? And they were like, all right. But that was the only thing that I had anything to do with. But when the second book came around, I was like, well, that first artist I thought did really well. I received a lot of compliments on that cover, even though I had nothing to do with it. So I was like, hey, what about the same artist? And my editor was like, okay, yeah, great. Let's run that up and find out what happens. And they said, nope, the market has been saturated with that particular type of design. And I was like, has it? But I don't know. And so
It's very common, like for graphic novels, they're the sort of a similar aesthetic with that,
Yeah.
with the first one.
And a
So-
similar color.
But the second time, they sent me samples from 5 different artists and asked me to rank them in my preference. Not promising that they would go with my choice, but and then then the person does some sketches and I get the sketches and they ask for feedback, but what they really want is just like a thumbs up. But they don't really want my feedback, which is good because like I don't have any qualifications for aesthetics in general, so like they shouldn't really ask for my detailed feedback. What they really want is to cover their butts so that at the end I don't come at the very last second where they've already paid the artist and it's really fully done and everything and say, oh my God, it's terrible. I can't have my book coming out and look like that. That's really all they want to hear, is that I'm not like furious or angry. What they really want is to let the artist and the marketing people, make those decisions.
Cover art is very important. It is.
It is.
I mean, people can say all they want. It is hugely important in marketing.
That's the first thing you see. How could it not be?
Absolutely huge. Yeah, I present beautifully, says this bookseller.
By the way.
But I have nothing to like, truly nothing to do with it, which is.
I remember when you came to present at the school, you showed the students that you had 2 different covers for Hoodie Rosen.
Yeah, I did. That's another like go-to for like if I do a school event.
Right.
I can tell them about anything about like the actual writing or book and stuff, and they're just like, oh, whatever. But as soon as I put the original cover sketch up versus the final one, and I say, can anyone spot any differences? They go nuts, and we can spend like they'll be locked in for like 40 minutes, naming every single tiny difference of detail between the original sketch they sent me and the final one. They're just
Yeah, they
like
love
locked
that.
in.
They love that. Do you have, was it published in England as well?
No, so the hoodie book is not published in the UK. Usually when that happens, they do a different
They
cover.
do it.
As I guess the
England
different,
has a different.
what they're
cover
sort of
usually.
asking for, what they want from the cover is different. The book was published in German, Dutch, and Russian. And they each of them I was just sort of disappointed that they all used the exact same cover, because I have some author, acquaintances or whatever, where the book came out in a couple of different languages, and that also meant that they got a couple completely different covers. And I was a little envious that, although I think it's very cool to have a copy of my book in a different language, I also was a little envious that the cover's the same in every single one of them. So yeah, it's the same thing.
I think the book would sell in Israel if you had it translated.
I think so. My agent lives in Israel, and she says that it's really, really difficult. There are so many symbols. Like here, a Jewish book like sticks out a little bit. Wait a little bit. Like if you have a
This
Jewish
is
coming of
unique,
age story.
But this is unique. More
That's
unique.
kind
You know,
of say.
There's a huge, when you walk into a Steinmatsky in Jerusalem, right in the middle of the store is a huge table of books in English.
Yeah, and that was another thing my
And
agent said,
Israelis are-
that if you sell it,
Sell it there in
so the
English.
Penguin, who owns, so like rights are sold, often set like. There are situations where a book might be sold, like, I don't know, let's just say I wrote a book and it was sold to HarperCollins. You could negotiate to sell them just North American rights or world rights. If you just sold them North American rights, the agent could then go to England and sell it to a different publisher in that market. What's interesting, in my books, they sold the world rights. So if they wanted to be sold in Israel, it would be, they couldn't just like get them through the normal Israeli distribution because they would have, like, Penguin in the United States would have to be the ones supplying it. And I think one of the reasons they don't tend to sell it in Israel or sell translations is just because like a lot of Israelis can read English, or if not, they prefer just to read Israeli books. So there hasn't been any traction in that space anyway, so far.
Yeah, a lot of the times in Israel, when you see books in English, they're paperback.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's an unrelated question,
That's
but when
great.
you start like a new book.
Yeah.
Where do you start?
I open like a Google Doc. Google Docs are good because they save automatically. It used to be you could forget to save.
Oh, yeah.
Or you could, like, Ernest Hemingway left a whole manuscript on a train,
Right.
whole book. He wrote a whole book.
That's awful.
He got on a train from Paris, I think, to Marseille, and when he got off the train, he just left it behind, never found it again. Whole book. And that's the only copy, it's gone forever.
Right.
And like that's unimaginable now, because like now it exists in like a million, my current draft exists in like 100,000 different ways. I will usually, before I start writing anything, I will start making like, not an outline, but I will like just write snippets. Either they are directives to myself, like this is what the main character should start. This is where they should be in their life at the beginning. This is the thing that I want to happen to them. This is where I vaguely want them to get at the end. I'll do things like that, where I'm just like addressing myself. And then there are other times where I will write like scenes I want to have, or even just like jokes I think are funny in that same document. I will also, as I am reading in preparation to write something, I will steal things that I will like, oh, this is something funny or entertaining, or this was done nicely, and I will just like type a copy of that in my document so I can change it just enough later so that it can go in my book without attribution for that original person. So that's another strategy. And then once I've got like, I'm sort of ready, which is not like sometimes that means like there's a deadline, or sometimes that just means I'm like, all right, like let's get started. I will just start. And then I try to keep myself on some kind of schedule of like, I have to write, if I have enough time, 5 pages a day, or I have to write 2 pages a day, with the understanding that I'm not allowed to ask myself if any of it is good. Because if I start doing that, if I start reviewing what I wrote the day before, I'll just get like mired in this, like, what should I, just questioning myself, what should I change, all of those sorts of things. And then I just keep going until it's over.
Yeah.
And I keep making notes on that side document. Every time I have a new thought, I'll just write it in there. And then, yeah, and then eventually it's just sort of done. And then I look for feedback from people. And I feel like I've never written a good first draft, and maybe there are people who do, but I think most people don't. And I think if you read the first draft of the Yo-Yo book, you would be like, this is not somebody, who knows how to write a book. And every time I've now written, I guess 7 or 8 full books, and every single time I sat down to do it, I felt like, oh my God, this is impossible. How did I ever write a previous one? How will I ever write one again? And eventually, I don't know, 1.5, 2 years later, I've written multiple drafts and gotten feedback, and I can look at it and it's gone from like something completely incomprehensible that seemed impossible to a finished product that even the books that I didn't publish, I'm like proud of in some way. Like they did something well, or I got something out of them that was helpful.
Right.
Even just one joke. There's a joke in the Hoodie book where Hoodie says to his sister, he's like, I'll kill you with my bare hands. And she's like, you couldn't kill me with your bare hands. He's like, I couldn't resist. It's like, why wouldn't I resist? And that book existed in the first novel I ever wrote, and then all of the subsequent ones until the Hoodie book. But it's a good, and now I was upset because I couldn't use it in the Yo-Yo book because Hoodie's already published. But it was a solid joke. So like, even if I got nothing else out of those first bunch of them, like I enjoyed finding a place for that in every single one of my books.
Yeah. When you start like moving from outline to doc.
They're both open in adjacent tabs.
Right.
Do you start at the beginning?
I do. But the thing is, other people don't, that's the crazy, like, there's no right way, like, to do it, there's a lot of, I think there's a software called Scrivener, which is like a special writing software, where you can write, like, there's like a separate scrolling thing on the side, almost like a table of contents that it makes for you. And you can make little notes, okay, this is chapter 1, here's the things that happen in it, all that, and you can bounce back and forth between them, and all kinds of, and people will do these very detailed outlines. And then they'll either write it in order, or they'll write scenes they feel like writing, or they'll write the scenes that they fully conceive of and fill in the rest later. There are other people who make no previous note documents, and just, fly by the seat of their pants. They literally don't know what writing that they're writing until they do it. They just start writing that works for them. So I don't think there's like a right, there's not like a right way to do it.
Oh, right way.
I should have said the word correct, so we avoided the pun, but I enjoyed it. It's a good pun, yeah. There is no right way. And I still think every time I do it that I have found just another wrong way, because it feels wrong, like it doesn't feel like it's good. I'm like, where are the notes that I made? These aren't in any decent order. It just like it has worked out so far. Not always, but some.
Do you think you'll publish the previous 5 books that you have?
I do not. I don't think they're very good. It's not entirely
Go back
true.
to redo them, or that would be too much,
I don't know, they feel like
Frustrating.
in poor practice that I needed to do. And there are 1 or 2 of them. I'll tell you about, but that I think could be okay, could be publishable book. If I could figure 1 or 2 things out about them, and I'm not close to the idea of like, if I figure it out, it's like there's one where you didn't ask this, but I'm gonna tell you, there's one where there's 4 teenagers, okay? Good friends, but they sort of had falling out, okay? And on this one night, this wizard shows up and he tells them that they have to find true love that night or the whole world will be destroyed. And there's 2 problems. One is that, well, 2 main problems. There are many problems, but 2 main problems. One of them, my buddy pointed out that if the threat is that the whole world will be destroyed, that actually isn't a threat. Because if the whole world is destroyed, no one will know that it's been destroyed and no one will have to deal with the fallout. So there's actually no threat of anybody suffering. So the consequences, the stakes that you're trying to set up that you thought are high stakes, if the world will be destroyed, that sounds really bad. It's actually totally fine. And there's no reason we should be working to avoid that. So that doesn't work as a threat from the wizard. And then the second thing is, why do they have to find true love? Why does this wizard want that? And I can't answer it until I figure that out, until someone in my brain or someone else helps me figure out what that would be. The story feels really purposeless. And I think otherwise it's fine, but
great practice.
thank you. I think it's a good but very flawed premise, and figure out how to fix the I could republish it. And I will also say that girls might like I think the word romantic, it's such good, it was like the love that they found was just that. So they don't find, they all go out and try to find what they think is true love, because that's what the wizard came to tell them about, and they all fail in that. It's a group, I don't know. I still can't figure out why the wizard would say that.
So this was book 2 of a 2-book contract?
Yes.
Now what? Is that a relief because that is done, or do you?
It is, and I have another 2-book deal.
Already, oh, yay.
I have another book that, if I can meet my deadline, big if, it'll come out in the fall of 2026. And the next one would come out, I guess, in the fall of 2028, if we're all still here.
So when you say you have a book deal, do you know anything about what the book will be about?
Not really. I had to submit an outline, but that's just like sort of a process. Like that was like, as soon as like a thing to get through the hoop. Like contracts, the contractual thing was like I had to submit an outline, a synopsis, and 50 pages or whatever. But as soon as the ink was dry, not real ink, digital ink, that it really stopped being. It's like the contract is you and Random House, but as soon as the contract is done, Penguin Random House stops caring, and it's really just between you and your editor. So like, I'm not really beholden to any of the stuff that I send to outline the pages or whatever, so long as she is cool with it. So I'm none of that. I can toss that all away so long as she's fine with what I sent her.
Are you able to write during the school year when you teach?
Yeah, I mean, I have to, yeah. Because otherwise I'm.
Is it easy for you? It's hard, yeah.
One more question or just comment?
Do you have a favorite genre to read and then just also, are you writing your favorite genre?
That is a great, all right, that's a great final question. My favorite genre to read, I would say, is just realistic fiction about just people living their lives. And I would say that I am writing it, except that I don't tend to, unless I'm reading for like research purposes, I don't tend to read young adult novels. I read a lot of them, but not because like that's what I would read if I weren't writing them. So like my favorite books to read are just like contemporary, just like, or not necessarily contemporary, but just literary fiction about regular people doing regular stuff. So this, I
Like
don't
name a recent favorite.
get a recent favorite. What did I read? Oh my goodness, that's like such a. The tricky thing is recent is I haven't read anything.
It could be a little while ago. Is that
Maybe a little
okay?
while
Yeah.
ago. What was that book I read, Ma? What was the book about the thrift shop in Tokyo?
Yeah, something.
The Nakano thrift shop. That was a great book
Cute.
about just an adult woman where absolutely nothing happened, but it was just a great world to spend a couple hundred pages in.
There's a whole subgenre of Japanese tea shops with cats and there's a lot of Japanese inspired. fiction.
Yeah. And but like old, like it's easier to be like classic, like I really love Richard Russo.
too.
Like Straight Man, which is just a book about interdepartmental politics at a small college. Like it doesn't sound interesting, but it's just a funny narrator living a normal week of life in a
Yeah.
with
I read a
really
lot of those.
vibrant characters. Or
Duck.
His audiobooks are also. good.
yeah, or the Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter is just a great sort of Jewish young man story. Nothing crazy happens, but just normal adult experience. When I was a little bit younger, I still really love these books. Like any of the Chaim Potok's My Name is Asher Lev or In the Beginning were both very loved so much, and I sort of go back to when I'm writing my stuff. Well, thank you so much for coming and for having a long guest.
How does it feel to have your book in your childhood library?
Really, really cool. It is really cool.
And first place of employment or no?
This was my first place of employment. I worked in the junior room when I was 14. It feels I did at the time think like, man, wouldn't it be cool to have a book in the library? And it is really, really neat to have my book in the library. And I do sometimes go to lmls.org and see if any of the copies are checked out. Yeah, I know it's weird. I sometimes do. And my second job, I left the junior room because I got a job at Cold Stone Creamery in Suburban Square.
Free samples.
That was way cooler.
Don't-
No offense. Ultimately,
No offense taken.
I like books better than I like ice cream, but it was a better job when I was 15.
And then went to libraries.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.